There's a lonely rock in the middle of the Wyoming desert. A century ago, it reached all the way into the White House and helped bring down part of the United States government. From a distance, it looks like nothing at all. Sagebrush, dry hills, and a lump of sandstone that people once thought resembled a giant teapot. You could drive past it in a minute and never think twice. What almost nobody realizes is that the oil buried under this spot set off the biggest corruption scandal America had ever seen. It held that record right up until Watergate. A sitting cabinet secretary took the bribes, and he went to federal prison for it. They called it Teapot Dome. And the strangest part is that the oil that started all of it is still down there right now. So how did an empty patch of Wyoming end up at the center of the biggest scandal of its age? And why is this same forgotten ground still one of the most important energy sites in America today? In the years before the First World War, the United States Navy was making a huge change. It was switching its warships from coal to oil. Almost overnight, oil became the fuel that powered the world's most advanced warships. A navy without oil was a navy that couldn't move. So the government took a handful of the richest oil fields in the country and set them aside as secret emergency reserves. They were locked away, untouched, saved for one purpose only. If the nation ever went to war, the Navy would have its own private oil. One of those reserves sat right here in Wyoming under that teapot-shaped rock. And the amount of oil down there was staggering. Surveys estimated the reserves together held hundreds of millions of barrels, nearly as much oil as the entire country had produced up to that point. This was a national treasure sitting quietly in the ground, and it was supposed to be off limits to everyone on Earth. Then in 1920, everything changed. A man named Warren Harding was elected president. Harding was a friendly, easygoing man who a lot of people thought was in well over his head. He was famous for one thing above all, handing the biggest jobs in the country to his poker buddies and old friends. The newspapers even had a nickname for that crowd. They called them the Ohio Gang. And one member of that crowd was about to make history. His name was Albert Fall. He was a rancher and a former senator from New Mexico, a tough frontier character with a big cattle ranch and one serious problem. He was deep in debt. His ranch was falling apart, and he owed years of back taxes he couldn't pay. He wasn't a man who could afford to say no to money. So Harding handed Albert Fall one of the most important positions in the entire government, Secretary of the Interior, and he had no idea what that desperate, broke man was about to do with it. Fall's first move looked small and boring. He quietly convinced Harding to transfer control of the Navy's secret oil reserves out of the Navy's hands and into his own department. He argued his people could simply manage them better. On paper, it was nothing but paperwork. In reality, it handed one man drowning in debt the keys to a national fortune he was never meant to touch. And what Albert Fall did with those keys became one of the most brazen crimes in the history of American politics. Before we get to it, if you like stories like this one, take a second and subscribe. We dig one of these up every single week. Now, here's exactly what he did. In secret, with no public announcement at all, Fall handed the entire Wyoming reserve to a single oil tycoon named Harry Sinclair. Then he handed a second reserve, out in California, to another tycoon named Edward Doheny. There was no public auction. There were no competing bids. Nobody else even got the chance to make an offer, which is exactly what the law was supposed to require. So how do you get a government official to sign away a national treasure? You pay him. Doheny sent Albert Fall $100,000 in cash, hand-delivered in a little black bag, and called it a loan. A loan with no interest, no paperwork, and no real intention of ever being paid back. That black bag became one of the most famous bribes in American history. Sinclair was even more generous. He funneled Fall around $300,000 in government bonds and cash. And then, on top of all that, he sent an entire herd of cattle to restock Fall's struggling ranch. All told, the bribes added up to roughly $400,000. In the 1920s, that was a jaw-dropping fortune, enough to set a man up for life. And for a while, Fall really thought he'd gotten away with it. The leases looked perfectly legal on paper. The money had come in quietly. And who on earth would ever be watching an empty patch of Wyoming desert? The answer, it turned out, was almost everyone. And the thing that gave Fall away was his own greed. For years, his ranch had been crumbling, with property taxes as much as 10 years overdue. Then, almost overnight, he paid off every last debt and started buying up all the land around him. In a small town, that kind of sudden, unexplained wealth doesn't go unnoticed. Out on the Wyoming range, a local oil man named Leslie Miller spotted something strange too. He watched trucks stamped with Sinclair's company logo hauling drilling equipment straight into a reserve that was supposed to be sealed shut. He knew something was deeply wrong, and he took it to his senator. And he wasn't the only one. A sharp-eyed New Mexico newspaperman named Carl McGee had been circling Albert Fall for years. Then one of Fall's own secretaries let something slip that said it all. He complained that his boss was handing out the nation's oil leases, in his words, like kisses. By the spring of 1922, it all spilled into the open. Newspapers splashed the secret deals across their front pages, and the United States Senate opened an investigation. Leading it was a stubborn, relentless senator from Montana named Thomas Walsh. And for a long, frustrating time, Walsh found almost nothing at all. Month after month, the hearings dragged on with no smoking gun. Fall swore everything was legal. The tycoons denied doing anything wrong. The whole investigation was slowly running out of air. And then one witness said something he could never take back. Edward Doheny, the California oil man, admitted right there, under questioning, that he had personally sent Fall that $100,000 in cash. The instant those words left his mouth, the entire scheme fell apart. It took years of trials and appeals, but in 1929, Albert Fall was finally convicted of accepting a bribe. He was sentenced to a year in prison and a $100,000 fine. And with that, he made history in the worst way imaginable. Albert Fall became the first member of a United States president's cabinet ever sent to prison for crimes committed while in office. The one man trusted to guard the nation's oil ended up in a federal cell for selling it. But here's the part almost nobody sees coming. Did the two oil men who paid those enormous bribes go down with him? They didn't. Both Sinclair and Doheny were found not guilty of paying the very bribes Fall was convicted of taking. So a man went to prison for accepting money that, according to the courts, no one was ever convicted of giving him. Harry Sinclair did eventually spend about 6 months behind bars, but not for the bribery. He got caught hiring private detectives to secretly follow the members of his own jury. Even his cover-up needed a cover-up. But the government did win the thing that mattered most. The Supreme Court ruled the secret leases were fraudulent and threw them out completely, handing the stolen oil reserves back to the nation. The tycoons kept their freedom, but they lost the prize they'd paid so much to steal. As for the president who let it all happen, he never had to answer for any of it. Warren Harding died suddenly in 1923, before the worst of the scandal broke. Some historians believe that dying was the only thing that saved him from impeachment. For the next 50 years, right up until Watergate, the words Teapot Dome were American shorthand for a corrupt government, all of it named after a single lonely rock in the Wyoming desert. So why was there a fortune in oil buried under this empty spot in the first place? Teapot Dome was really just one small corner of a much bigger prize, a giant oil field called Salt Creek. Deep underground, the rock here is folded upward into an enormous dome shape, and that dome acts like a natural trap, gathering up oil and holding it locked in place for millions of years. It's the same kind of structure that holds oil fields all over the world, from Texas to the Middle East. That trapped oil turned the nearby town of Casper into one of the great oil boom towns of the American West. Long before a scandal made its name famous, this quiet stretch of Wyoming was already one of the most productive oil regions in the entire country. After the scandal, the Teapot Dome field went silent. It sat abandoned for 49 years, a piece of poisoned history that nobody wanted to touch. But Teapot Dome wasn't finished. In 1976, the oil finally started flowing again. And in 2015, the federal government sold the whole field off to a private company for $45 million. Over its long life, this one field pulled more than 20 million barrels of oil out of the ground and earned over $500 million. The reserve that once bribed a cabinet secretary had quietly turned back into an ordinary oil field. And the bigger story is the ground all around it. Teapot Dome sits inside the Powder River Basin, and modern drilling has kicked off a whole new oil revival across the region. The same rock that triggered a national scandal a century ago is pumping oil again right now. You'd never guess it to look at the place, and oil is only part of what this state is holding. Wyoming has the smallest population in the entire country, fewer people than almost anywhere in America, and yet it quietly produces more coal than any other state, and more uranium too. The coal, the oil, the gas, and the uranium under this one empty state help keep the lights on across the whole nation. The men who fought over this oil are gone now, Albert Fall was released from prison, lost his ranch, and died broke, his name a permanent byword for corruption. The tycoons who bought him faded into the footnotes. Even the scandal itself slowly shrank into a single line in the history books. But the oil never left. The reserves, the coal, and the uranium beneath Wyoming still flow out into the rest of the country. They quietly power cities that have never once heard the name Teapot Dome. The scandal was the part everyone remembered. The oil was the part that lasted. And more than 100 years after it helped bring down part of a government, the ground beneath Teapot Dome is still working.